In the deepest archives of European history lies a story so extraordinary, so tragic, that it reads like a dark fairy tale. Imagine a princess born with an inbreeding coefficient so extreme it exceeded what would result from a parent-child union. A young woman whose very existence defied the odds, yet whose brief life would trigger the most devastating war Europe had ever seen. This is the story of Maria Antonia of Austria, not the Marie Antoinette you know, but a forgotten princess whose 23 years on earth carried the weight of empires. Born in 1669 as the most inbred Habsburg in history, she survived when she shouldn't have, loved when she couldn't, and died when Europe needed her most. Today, we unlock the vault of her extraordinary life, from the glittering palaces of Vienna to the tragic birthing chambers where her destiny was sealed. This is a story of genetic peril and political power, of diamonds that crossed continents, and a legacy written in both blood and brilliance. To understand Maria Antonia's story, we must first grasp the impossible world she was born into. The House of Habsburg had conquered much of Europe not through warfare, but through a calculated strategy of strategic marriages. Their motto was simple: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. But by 1669, this policy had created something unprecedented in royal history. When Maria Antonia drew her first breath at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna on January 18th, she carried within her the accumulated genetic burden of centuries of intermarriage. Her father, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, had married his own niece, Margaret Theresa of Spain. But the web of consanguinity ran deeper still. Her maternal grandparents were themselves uncle and niece. The numbers tell a staggering story. Maria Antonia's inbreeding coefficient reached 0.3053, higher than what modern genetics would expect from direct parent-offspring unions. She was, quite literally, the most inbred member of the most inbred dynasty in European history. To put this in perspective, her coefficient was higher than that of her infamous uncle, Charles II of Spain, whose genetic burden made him the poster child for Habsburg decline. Yet here lies the first miracle of her story. She lived. While Charles II suffered from the characteristic Habsburg jaw, developmental delays, and countless ailments that left him barely able to govern, Maria Antonia defied every genetic prediction. She was described as intelligent, cultured, and remarkably relatively healthy. She spoke multiple languages, showed a passion for music inherited from her parents, and displayed the refined manners expected of a Habsburg princess. She was the exception that proved the rule, a genetic anomaly who would become a political catalyst. But her survival came at a price that would haunt her entire family line. The burden of survival. Maria Antonia's survival came at a terrible cost that revealed the true horror of Habsburg genetics. She was the only child of her parents' marriage to reach adulthood. Her older brother Ferdinand had died before her birth. Two younger siblings, John and Maria Anna, perished in infancy, their tiny bodies unable to withstand the genetic burden they carried. The pattern was heartbreakingly consistent across the Habsburg line. Her mother, Margaret Theresa, had endured 6 pregnancies in 6 years, suffering multiple miscarriages and watching 3 of her 4 children die. The physical and emotional toll was devastating. When Margaret Theresa herself died in March 1673 at just 21, 4-year-old Maria Antonia found herself thrust into an impossible position. She was now the heiress presumptive to the Spanish throne, the most powerful empire on earth. Her uncle, Charles II of Spain, was childless and, given his severe disabilities, unlikely to produce an heir. Suddenly, this little girl carried the future of 2 continents in her bloodline. The political implications were staggering. European powers watched her every move, calculating their strategies around her potential reign. Diplomats scrutinized her health, her education, her every public appearance. She lived under a microscope, a child whose genetic lottery ticket had made her the most valuable political asset in Europe. Her father, Leopold I, understood this value all too well. He commissioned numerous portraits of his daughter, sending them across Europe to promote her claim to the Spanish throne. These weren't mere family keepsakes, they were political propaganda, visual arguments for why this young girl should inherit an empire. The impossible marriage proposal. In 1676, when Maria Antonia was just 6 years old, her father made a proposal so shocking it stunned even the Habsburg court, notorious as it was for unconventional marriages. She should marry her own uncle, Charles II of Spain. The plan was to unite the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg lines, ensuring the empire's continuity through the most direct bloodline possible. Even in a family where uncle-niece marriages were common, this match raised eyebrows. Charles II was 13, already showing signs of the genetic disorders that would plague his entire life. He could barely chew his food due to his severely deformed jaw, suffered from numerous health problems, and displayed signs of intellectual disability. Maria Antonia was a child of 6. The age gap was problematic, but the genetic implications were terrifying. The engagement was formally announced and proxy wedding plans were made. Europe held its breath, watching to see if this ultimate Habsburg gamble would proceed. Courtiers whispered about the potential consequences. What kind of children might result from such a union? Could the Habsburg line survive another generation of such extreme inbreeding? But fate intervened in the form of Spanish desperation. Charles II, despite his youth and disabilities, was under enormous pressure to produce an heir immediately. Spain couldn't wait for his 6-year-old niece to reach marriageable age. The engagement was broken, and he married Marie-Louise d'Orléans instead, a decision that would ultimately reshape European history. The jeweled inheritance. As Maria Antonia grew into adolescence, she inherited a collection of magnificent jewels that carried their own mysteries and political significance. The most intriguing piece came from her mother's deathbed bequest, a treasure that would spark centuries of speculation among jewelry historians. In 1673, as Margaret Theresa lay dying at just 21, she made a careful inventory of her possessions. Her testament named Maria Antonia as her sole heiress, with one notable exception: a great breast ornament with a great diamond in the midst, which she specifically bequeathed to her husband, Leopold I. This single line in a legal document would become one of the most debated passages in royal jewelry history. What was this great diamond? The testament offers no description of its color, cut, or origin. 17th century clerks rarely bothered with such details. But the emphasis on its size suggests something truly exceptional. Some historians theorize this might have been the stone later known as the Wittelsbach Blue, though this remains unproven speculation. The rest of Maria Antonia's collection was equally impressive. Spectacular emeralds from her mother's Spanish dowry, ropes of pearls, and diamond-encrusted brooches that represented political alliances stretching across Europe. Each piece told a story of power and diplomacy. When she wore these jewels, she wasn't simply dressing, she was making statements about legitimacy and inheritance rights. Her jewelry became weapons of soft power, communicating dynastic claims more effectively than diplomatic notes. Every jewel was a calculated choice in the high-stakes game of European succession politics. The loveless marriage. In 1685, at 16, Maria Antonia married Maximilian II Emanuel, Elector of Bavaria, in a ceremony that glittered with political promise but lacked any warmth of genuine affection. It was a strategic alliance designed to strengthen Habsburg claims to Spain while bringing Bavaria into the Austrian sphere of influence. But it was also a personal disaster waiting to unfold. Contemporary accounts describe the couple as fundamentally incompatible in every way that mattered. Maximilian was extroverted, militarily ambitious, and possessed of what one observer called one of the most perverse minds and hearts that one can imagine. He was a social butterfly who thrived on court intrigue and military campaigns. Maria Antonia, by contrast, was serious, devout, and intellectual, a young woman who preferred books to balls and found the frivolity of court life exhausting. The incompatibility became apparent almost immediately. Maximilian wasted no time betraying his young wife, openly parading his mistresses, while Maria Antonia endured the cold formality of Bavarian court life. His most notorious affair was with Countess Canossa, whom he flaunted so brazenly that even the notoriously permissive Bavarian court was scandalized. When Maximilian was appointed governor of the Spanish Netherlands in 1692, a position Leopold I had promised him as part of the marriage negotiations, he departed for Brussels with his mistress in tow, leaving his pregnant wife behind in Vienna. The insult was deliberate and public, a humiliation that Maria Antonia felt keenly. By this point, the marriage had produced two tragic pregnancies. Leopold Ferdinand, born in May 1689, lived only 2 days. Anton, born in November 1690, was either stillborn or died on the day of his birth. The pattern seemed set. Even Maria Antonia's remarkable genetics couldn't overcome the accumulated burden of centuries of inbreeding when combined with the stress of an unhappy marriage. The miracle and the tragedy. Then came October 1692, and against all odds, Maria Antonia gave birth to a healthy son, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. The child's birth was celebrated across Europe as nothing short of miraculous. Here, finally, was the heir who could resolve the Spanish succession crisis peacefully. The boy represented a compromise candidate, Habsburg blood through his mother, but Bavarian independence through his father, making him acceptable to powers that feared either French or Austrian dominance. Charles II of Spain himself recognized the child's importance, eventually naming Joseph Ferdinand as his heir in his will. The Treaty of The Hague in 1698 designated the 6-year-old as the future King of Spain, with European powers agreeing to support his claim. For a brief moment, it seemed that Maria Antonia's son might prevent the continental war that everyone feared. But Maria Antonia's triumph was heartbreakingly brief. Childbirth in the 17th century was perilous under the best circumstances, and she had endured years of stress, unhappiness, and the physical strain of multiple difficult pregnancies. Postpartum infections set in, what we now know as puerperal sepsis, a bacterial infection that was often fatal in an era before antibiotics. The infection was complicated by what contemporary sources described as a deep melancholy, almost certainly postpartum depression, exacerbated by her isolation from her unfaithful husband and the enormous pressure she faced as the mother of Europe's most important child. She had given birth to the heir everyone wanted, but she was dying even as diplomats celebrated her son's existence. As Christmas Eve 1692 dawned, 23-year-old Maria Antonia took her final breath in the Hofburg Palace where she had been born. She had survived the genetic odds, navigated the treacherous waters of European politics, and produced the heir Europe desperately needed. But she would never see her son grow up, never know that her brief life had created a moment of hope in a continent heading toward war. The final act of defiance. Even in death, Maria Antonia demonstrated the strength and intelligence that had carried her through life. In her final will, executed as she lay dying, she made decisions that revealed both her pain and her political acumen. She completely disinherited her unfaithful husband, leaving everything, her jewels, her personal possessions, and most importantly, her Spanish succession rights, directly to her infant son. The will was a masterpiece of legal and political strategy. By bypassing Maximilian entirely, she ensured that Bavarian claims to Spanish territories would rest solely with Joseph Ferdinand, not with his potentially unreliable father. She also specified that if her son died before reaching majority, her possessions should pass to her father, Leopold I, rather than to her husband, a final insult to the man who had made her life miserable. Her jewels, including that magnificent blue diamond, were carefully catalogued and preserved for Joseph Ferdinand. The inventory reveals the extent of her collection: diamond necklaces, emerald parures, pearl ropes, and countless brooches and rings that represented not just personal adornment, but portable wealth and political symbols. But the child's fate would prove even more tragic than his mother's. In February 1699, at just 6 years old, Joseph Ferdinand died suddenly of smallpox while living in Brussels. Some whispered of poison, though nothing was ever proven. With his death, Europe's last hope for peaceful succession died too. The war that followed. Maria Antonia's death had removed the compromise candidate from the Spanish succession. Her son's death 6 years later eliminated the last peaceful solution. When Charles II of Spain finally died in November 1700, Europe exploded into the War of Spanish Succession, 13 years of devastating conflict that would reshape the continent forever. The war that followed claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and redrew the map of Europe. Battles raged from the Netherlands to Italy, from Spain to Germany. The French Bourbons ultimately claimed the Spanish throne, ending Habsburg rule in Spain forever, but at an enormous cost in blood and treasure. All because a young woman who shouldn't have lived did, and then died too soon. Had Maria Antonia lived longer, had Joseph Ferdinand survived to adulthood, the entire course of European history might have been different. The War of Spanish Succession might never have happened, saving countless lives and preserving the delicate balance of power that had kept Europe relatively stable. The scattered legacy. Maria Antonia's material legacy scattered across Europe like her genetic inheritance. The Wittelsbach Blue Diamond began an odyssey that would take it through various royal collections before eventually being sold at auction in 2008 for over $24 million, at the time the highest price ever paid for a diamond. Her other jewels disappeared into private collections, their stories lost to time, their beauty preserved but their historical significance forgotten. But her true legacy lies in the historical chain reaction her brief life created. She was the genetic anomaly who survived impossible odds, the political catalyst who briefly offered Europe peace, and the tragic figure whose death unleashed a continental war. Her story demonstrates how individual lives, no matter how brief, can alter the course of history in ways that echo through centuries. Maria Antonia of Austria lived just 23 years, but those years contained enough drama, tragedy, and historical significance for several lifetimes. She was born carrying the heaviest genetic burden in European royal history, yet she defied every prediction to become an intelligent, cultured woman who briefly held the fate of empires in her hands. Her story reminds us that behind every historical statistic lies a human being. A young woman who loved music, endured an unhappy marriage, mourned her lost children, and died far too young. She was simultaneously the most inbred princess in history and one of its most consequential figures, a walking contradiction who embodied both the triumph and the tragedy of the Habsburg dynasty. In the end, Maria Antonia's greatest tragedy wasn't her genetics or her unhappy marriage, it was timing. She lived just long enough to offer Europe hope, then died just soon enough to plunge it into war. Her son's brief life extended that hope for 6 precious years before extinguishing it forever, leaving a continent with no choice but to settle the Spanish succession through blood and steel. Today, when we see the Wittelsbach Diamond in museums or read about the War of Spanish Succession in history books, we're witnessing the ripple effects of one extraordinary life. Maria Antonia of Austria, the most inbred princess in history, proved that sometimes the most unlikely people shape the course of nations, not through their actions, but through their very existence and the timing of their departure from this world. Her diamonds may have scattered, her empire may have fallen, but her story endures as a testament to the complex interplay between genetics and destiny, between personal tragedy and historical consequence. She was, in every sense, a princess who changed the world simply by existing, and then by ceasing to exist at precisely the wrong moment in history. Which aspect of Maria Antonia's extraordinary story fascinated you most? Was it her miraculous survival against genetic odds, her tragic marriage, or the war that followed her death? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden corners of royal history, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. There are so many more untold stories waiting in the royal vaults, stories of forgotten princesses, lost jewels, and the remarkable women who shaped our world from behind palace walls.